This past week marks kind of a big occasion for me. As of February 10th, I have been on this Erath for 3 decades. And man, am I feeling old. I've always had trouble coming to grips with my oldening. Every year, my birthday's a little bit tough for me to deal with. But I always find a way around it, usually in the form of playing through one of my top 10 favorite games. Unfortunately, all my favorite games that are relatively short form I've already done, and as much as I would like to go through any number of 80-hour RPG epics, it's just not in the cards right now. So, backup plan, we're gonna go back to the past. Samurai Jack. Okay, not actually, but we are gonna go back to the past in the form of FantasyZone 2, The Tears of Opa-Opa, on the Sega Master System. This game is important for so many reasons. First, this is the sequel to the original FantasyZone, one of the first games I ever reviewed. And indeed, that was the review I learned that I can't deal with script writing or reading, so I just learned to ad-lib everything. And honestly, I think I sound infinitely better for it. So all of those people who tell me that it's very blatantly obvious, it sounds like I'm reading off a script, no, this is just how my voice sounds. I'm winging every single bit of this. Sorry, I've seen comments like that a few times. It really bugs me when people say that they clearly can tell I'm reading off a script. Nope. Just going off the top of my head here. But important reason number B, FantasyZone, and its sequel, this very game, happens to feature the protagonist, Opa-Opa. This awesome little mascot actually is one of Sega's earliest mascots. In fact, as far as I can track back, he is the earliest, predating Alex Kidd, which is, you know, kind of a big deal. It's a shame he doesn't usually get more than a couple of cameos here and there. Although I do have a statuette of him that I am absolutely way too proud of, but I love this thing. And finally, the most important reason why I want to talk about this game today, a time where I want to look back on my childhood a little bit and see some of the more important games. Well, this is the game. The singular game. You can track every single thing from this channel and indeed my life all the way back to this singular point of origin. This is the first game I ever played. And man, let me tell you, this was one hell of a way to start a career. The story to FantasyZone 2, The Tears of Opa-Opa, is actually relatively impressive when you consider what the game is. It's a 2D side-scrolling shmup on the Sega Master System, and yet it manages to have a pretty deep and thought-provoking plot for a game that probably shouldn't have any story whatsoever given its genre, and yet still manages to cram it all into 2 text scrolls. Okay, sure, they're not fully animated cutscenes, and it's not a lot of story, but they still manage to deal with some pretty interesting topics. The game starts off 10 years past the events of the original FantasyZone, with our hero Opa-Opa wondering what exactly was with that final encounter, and what was going on with the evil forces in the previous game. And the FantasyZone's slowly expanding, but there's even more hostile threats taking over like all of it, and Space Harrier is too lazy and sucky to be the real hero FantasyZone needs, so it's up to the proper hero, Opa-Opa, to do it right. And yet, somehow, in all of this, it also manages to tackle concepts of PTSD and mental health. You kind of have to get to the final text scroll to really understand, but the title is actively worked into the whole plot and the deeper meaning of this game. And that's a pretty ambitious sort of concept to tackle for this kind of game, with how little plot it actually has to work with. It's genuinely quite fascinating to see, and I think it was really well done for what this game was really able to do. It managed to accomplish quite a lot overall. Even though this game doesn't really have a lot of cutscenes and room for plot, it still managed to accomplish a pretty thought-provoking and meaningful story, I think. The gameplay to FantasyZone 2, The Tears of Opa-Opa, is just as well polished and refined as the original, but there are some subtle changes. The game itself is a horizontal scrolling shmup with the main concept of clearing each level by destroying enemy bases and finding the enemy boss. If you clear the boss, you move on to the next area. Hopefully you don't die in the meantime. Pretty similar to the first game, yeah, but there are some subtle differences. First and foremost, in the previous game, shops showed up once you hit a certain point threshold. And if you missed the shop, well, you kinda had to go without, you know, buying stuff and powering up your character, and that's not so good. Here, shops are permanently placed in each level. You just have to know where to go, and it's always going to be there. which leads to the next interesting bit, which is the levels are far more complex than the previous game. Whereas the previous Fantasy Zones were a single long stretch that repeated itself ad infinitum, now each level is actually 3 strips that have individual warp zones between them, with a final warp zone leading to the boss. So not only do you have to clear basically 1 level, you actually have to clear 3, and each level of each stage happens to have different enemy spawn locations, so it does give it a slightly different feeling. And what's really cool visually, they all have different backgrounds and stuff, which kind of blows my mind. They basically had to create 3 different visual backdrops for every single level. How cool is that? And finally, to get to the boss, well, you have to find another warp. And the important thing about having to locate a boss warp in order to actually, get to the boss, as opposed to the original Fantasy Zone style of just destroy all the bases and boom, you're at the boss, this gives you time to prepare. You can theoretically grind enemies to pick up money, which you can then go to a shop to buy all the upgrades you need. Whereas in the previous one, well, once you destroy the last base, you're at the boss. If you die at the boss, you can spawn a shop again, and you're just fighting the boss again. And you're going to be met with an ever-dwindling supply of money should you choose to purchase those power-ups. Here, as long as you can survive, you theoretically could last forever before you actually need to properly fight the boss, giving you ample time to prepare and create a setup that's personally going to be very effective to the boss based on your own playstyle. That's really quite impressive, I think. Now that said, this game, I think in terms of gameplay, is sort of iconic. I think it's very standout and very good, even though I don't think all that many people played this game. I look back to other people I know who started playing games around the time I did, and they fondly remember stuff like Contra and Gradius and Ghosts and Goblins and how very, very difficult they were to start out with. And honestly, looking back at those 3 games comparatively, those games are total jokes. This game is significantly more difficult. In fact, I think this is probably one of the toughest games I've ever played. But let's break it down here for a second. Let's just indulge me in that comparison for a moment. Understanding for a moment that a comparison really is apples to oranges, let's just for a moment try and compare the difficulty a little bit. Let me have this. It's my birthday and I'm a crotchety old man. Get off my lawn, you damn dirty kids. So let's compare this game to Contra. Well, ignoring the fact that Contra has basically unlimited lives if you know the code, yeah, you still got some continues, and oh yeah, your weapons, as long as you don't die, you can hold on to them. In Fantasy Zone, you get 3 lives and you're done. And your weapons, 99% of them actually wear off after about 10 seconds, so you really gotta know what you're doing with them. Ghosts and Goblins, what a total joke. You get 2 hits before you die, and you have unlimited continues. Here, no. There's none of that. While you do ostensibly have a health bar, any physical contact with your opponents will kill you, and that health bar is only decreased by enemy bullets, which don't actually start until the 2nd or 3rd level. So it's pretty much irrelevant at that point. And you don't get continues, and you only get a continue if you buy one at the end of the game, or you find one at the end of the game. So you better be a damn lot better at this game than Ghosts and Goblins, because this is a lot harder. Oh, and what's that? Gradius? Well, your fancy options and the fact you actually get to hold on to your weapons, yeah, you're nowhere near as tough as this game, sorry. And if we're continuing the comparison train, again, just to indulge me, I'm sorry, it's my birthday, let me do this. You know those fancy, beautiful cave shooters? I love these things. I've said this before, I cannot for the life of me understand how hitboxes in that game work, because there's a little concept in those games called bullet grazing. Like, your character flies through bullets, but it doesn't hit like the magical glowy pixel in the center, so you don't take damage. Yeah, that concept doesn't really functionally work in my brain, and the reason is, you see that sprite, the one what is what you are in this game? Every single individual pixel of that sprite, yeah, that's your hitbox. And if you come into contact with anything, you're dead. Yeah, this game is a lot less forgiving than a lot of shmups out there. It's not to say any of those games are bad, but when I'm told that those games are significantly harder than the games I played when I was a kid, yeah, no. And for further proof of how difficult this game is, well, let's put it this way. I've been playing this game since, I was 0, ostensibly. I don't think I beat the first boss until I was like 7. And, if you're watching footage of the first level, you're probably thinking, oh, what are you talking about? This game's bright, it's colorful, there's not too many enemies, there's no bullets or anything. What's the problem? Well, yeah, the first stage is actually pretty easy, until you get to the end and you have to fight the Danmaku Deadly Death Driftwood of Doom that fills the entire room with freaking logs of death. Yeah, this boss is kind of ridiculous for the first stage. Especially weird because later bosses are actually significantly easier, at least in the sense that they give you a lot more real estate to move around. This first boss is basically a giant gatekeeper and tutorial on how proper positioning works. And again, with your entire hitbox being your sprites, you really have to understand positioning. If nothing else, this game is a great teacher for trying to figure out proper positioning for bullet hells and stuff. It's quite fascinating like that. But gameplay-wise, FantasyZone Tears of Opa-Opa, very, very difficult. Very, very fun. This game is ridiculously difficult, infinitely challenging, and just an absolute well-crafted little game. You have two main weapons. You have your bomb as well as your standard shot, which can be upgraded and augmented with different weapons in stores. But like I said during the comparison, most of those are on a timer that kind of ticks away at about 10 seconds. Granted, you can find a hidden power-up later in the game that will extend that, but it's still kind of not really a thing you're going to be dealing with early game. And indeed, at this point, I basically consider most of the weapons kind of worthless because they're going to run out before you take out most bosses, unfortunately. Because this game does have some really rockin' weapons. You can also upgrade your ship's thrusters from, you know, your small wings to bigger wings to jet engines to rocket engines to it's going to move so fast you can't actually control it, which, you know, when I was a kid, helped me learn that, you know, just because something's ostensibly an upgrade doesn't mean that's actually something you want. You have to be smart with your upgrades. And that's why faster scrolling shmups, I actually tend to play slower. I prefer the precision and slow movement to the high speed and attempting to dodge everything, meeting it at its own pace. This game is, if nothing else in my life, quite a great teacher and quite a great influence on how I've actively played games, especially shmups in the past. And even though I'm not the biggest fan of horizontally scrolling shmups, honestly, I definitely prefer vertical. This game I think will always remain special and definitely gameplay-wise, probably one of my favorite shmups of all time, and certainly one that is infinitely playable, and I'm able to go back and pretty much just pick this up fresh and just easily play it. Honestly, if I ever have kids, I think this is going to be the first game I give them because it's got an awesome mix of bright, colorful visuals, cheery music, easy to pick up and play controls, and a damn near diamond solid challenge. This game, it ain't easy. And this game also doesn't feature cheats to make you feel better when you can't actually progress on your own. No, this game actually encourages and indeed requires you to actually get better as you play, or else you're never gonna see the end of this game. You're not. But it's a great teacher, and I think this is a great game mechanically to get kids into because it does not just hand you things when you fail once, like Mario seems to be nowadays, or most kid games, honestly. I think a proper kids game still needs to respect a child player and give them a challenge, and not simply give them something when they have trouble trying to accomplish any goal whatsoever. And this game's uncompromising difficulty, I think, does that excellently, while still providing an experience that's quite visually stimulating and enjoyable. Now, the overall presentation to FantasyZone 2, The Tears of Opa-Opa, is something that will remain with me forever, I think. I still remember my pre-1-year-old self first playing this game and being greeted by the bright, colorful logo on that bright pink background and the beautiful, beautiful verdant hills of Pasteria, the first level, along with the bright, almost rainbow colors and the many, many flowers of pretty much every different color. This game is so beautiful. The first level to this is probably its best level visually, and it's just so striking and so, I don't know, just perfect. And that's a word I don't use a lot in games, but I think the first world, like just the starting area of the first world, it has just such an amazing background that I don't think I could describe it as anything else. In fact, when I saw an updated visuals version of this, I was actually disappointed because I didn't think it looked as good, honestly. And the world is full of many, many different enemies. Each stage has different enemies as well as different enemy spawners, and the bosses are all giant and awesome. There's lots and lots of color in this game, and given how bright and colorful that first starting level screen is, I think that honestly influenced how much I enjoy color in video games. which has made these past few console generations a little rough for me personally, but, you know, I think it's safe to say that visually this game has influenced me a lot. Hell, everything about this game has. And the soundtrack to this game is amazing. I think the title screen theme, even though it's only probably about 30 seconds long, will be seared into my brain until the day I die. It's that damn catchy. First stage, awesome. Let me just say it this way. It's FantasyZone music, it's all good, it's tremendous, and it's not going to let you down. In terms of presentation, I think this is honestly one of the nicest looking games I've ever seen. Maybe not the most graphically, you know, fantastic, it is an SMS game, but aesthetically speaking, this is one of the most beautiful games I think I have ever seen. Now, if you want a copy of FantasyZone 2, The Tears of Opa-Opa on the SMS, the Sega Master System, cheapest one I'm seeing on eBay right now, shipping included, is about $80. And honestly, I really should try and track down a copy of this, if only for posterity. That said, I do have a digital copy that I bought on my Wii back in the day, and you can even get it on your 3DS now, although that's a slightly different version. And this game was actually put out a few different times. Unlike the original FantasyZone, it was not originally made for the arcades and then ported to the SMS. It was actually specifically made for the SMS. And then, as I understand, later on, I believe around the PS2 era, when they created the Sega Ages FantasyZone collection, they created sort of like a what-if version of this game that would be, what if this game actually was running on that arcade hardware? And honestly, it looks breathtaking, but like I said in the presentation, I think this version is still probably my favorite. There's also the 3DS version, which actually plays a little bit differently. First of all, I can tell you because I have played it, the first boss is completely different and significantly easier. It's also genuinely a lot less terrifying than a bloodshot Cyclops death log of doom. But also, there's like a night and day mode where every level has like a second iteration of it, and you get like a different story with it too, as well as a few other different unlockables and stuff. It's not bad if you can get it for cheap, but like I said, I think the SMS version is probably the way to go. But that said, FantasyZone 2, The Tears of Opa-Opa, would I recommend this game? The origins of, in a sense, my entire life? Well, if you like shmups, if you like bright, colorful games, if you like games that are willing to challenge you, if you're a big fan of fun, arcadey shooting type of games, yeah, I think this game is quite special. I mean, the only game I can think of that's kind of like FantasyZone would be Twin Bee. It's like the only other cute 'em up that immediately jumps out at me. I think FantasyZone completely stomps Twin Bee into the dirt. FantasyZone 2, The Tears of Opa-Opa. Well, it's probably not my favorite shmup of all time. It is definitely up there. And if nothing else, this is quite possibly the singular most important game of my life. I can only think of maybe one other game that tops it, and even then, I'm not sure it's more important than this game. I love this game with a passion. I'm not afraid to point out I'm entirely biased by this, but if you want to see where my history comes from, look no further than FantasyZone 2.